So we're kind of coming to the end of like the actual session itself, right? We've looked at the warm-up, we've looked at the main component. We're now going to look at the cool down. In fact, let me remind you, we have looked at the warm-up. If you haven't done that tutorial, I recommend you doing so. We've looked at the main component and the different features of that, including the introduction of the skill. We've looked at developing through practices into conditioned games and then the final activity. And in this session, we're going to talk about the cool down. Okay, so this one is about the third phase within our particular session. Remember, this should be well planned, well considered, and should relate to the session itself. So let's think about the cool down. There's really two components to it. Component one is we have some kind of pulse lowering activity. Pulse lowering activity. Now, this isn't going to surprise you. I'm sure you've taken part in one or two cool downs in your time, but we want some kind of pulse lowering activity. And these are activities which gradually, critical word, guys, not all of a sudden, but gradually decrease in intensity. So think about that a second. When you do a cool down, it should start not high intensity, but it should have the capacity to get lower as the cool down progresses. Okay, so it's going to gradually decrease in intensity. That's really important. And you probably find, I just want to give a bit of a time scale here. You probably find that that is going to be something along the lines of 5 minutes. Sometimes people do it for less, around about 2 to 3, but I would recommend around about 5 minutes for that if you're able to find that within your session. And then secondly, guys, within the cool down, we need to do stretching. Okay, so it's so easy not to do this at the end, but I really, really recommend that you build this as good practice into your session. Certainly those that are observing you will expect you to do this, so make sure you do. We call them maintenance stretches. Maintenance, there's an I in there. Maintenance stretches. These are stretches that, you know, you're doing them because you've worked that area of the body and, you just want to recover properly. But we also have what are called development stretches. Now, these aren't necessarily different techniques, but you use development stretches to actually maximize flexibility, because in the cool down, your muscles are warm and they've been worked, and you can actually develop flexibility through these development stretches by thinking, okay, this is actually a good time to improve and work on our flexibility through some mobility training, some stretching, right? So that makes sense. But also, I mean, this is going to be a bit of a sort of a long old list, but I want to put them in here for you. I just want to remind you of probably the muscle groups that you're going to stretch. Identify a stretch for the deltoids. In most cases, you're going to need a deltoid stretch. You want to be identifying a stretch for the bicep. It's actually tricky to stretch the bicep, interestingly. You want to be developing a stretch for the tricep, easier to stretch through active stretching. You're also going to identify a stretch for the erector spinae group. This is the muscles on the lower back, and typically you stretch those by extending your spine, actually. So the erector spinae group. You're going to stretch your abdominals. Okay, they're pretty likely to have worked as sort of core stabilizing muscles during your activity. You're going to stretch your obliques. We tend to do this through kind of twisting based stretches. So think about that. We want to think about your hip flexors, the muscles that cause flexion in your hip. We know that the flexion of the hip is the leg moving in front of us. We know that from Unit 3. You're probably also going to stretch your gluteus maximus. Again, remember, your gluteus maximus is a muscle that is responsible for extension at the hip. Again, just making reference there to Unit 3. You need a stretch that's going to stretch your quadricep. That's the muscle on the front of your thigh. So typically that involves sort of obviously bending the knee and pulling on the foot typically. You're going to need to identify hamstring stretches. Hamstrings, and I've not really left myself enough room here. Let me see if I can just go down a touch further. Here we go. And I'd like you to identify a stretch for gastrocnemius. Now, look, if it happens to be the case that you haven't used some of those muscles, I mean, it's unlikely, but let's say you didn't use some of those muscles in your session, I suppose you could miss them out. But guys, these are really a stretching routine and regimen that you should be looking to incorporate into your cool down. So I challenge you at this point to go and study those muscle areas and get a decent stretch. That's our cool down, pulse lowering stretching, as we've just talked about. Thanks.